Sophie Langston had never been someone who attracted trouble. She lived a quiet, structured life, one carefully designed to accommodate the limitations her body placed upon her. At 42, she had spent years adapting to the reality of her condition, working from home as a freelance technical writer, avoiding unnecessary stress, and meticulously planning her daily routine to ensure she could manage her symptoms. The multiple sclerosis diagnosis had been a turning point, reshaping her world into something smaller, more controlled. She did not see herself as a victim. This was simply life, and life required adjustments. It was why, after careful consideration, she had chosen to move into a gated residential complex just outside Raleigh, North Carolina. The apartment had been expensive, a luxury she could afford only because of a small inheritance left to her by her late mother. It was a quiet, well-maintained building with strict security, a 24-hour concierge, and key fob access to all shared spaces. The appeal had been simple. It was safe, predictable, and catered to people who valued privacy. No noisy college students, no questionable landlords, no unexpected maintenance issues, just an orderly environment where she could focus on her work and her health. At least that was the promise. The first time she met Karen Blakely, Sophie immediately recognized the type. In her mid-50s, impeccably put together in that aggressively polished way that suggested she treated neighborhood disputes with the same level of intensity as a corporate merger. Karen exuded the controlled authority of someone who had spent far too many years in a position of power with no real oversight. She was the president of the residential board, the self-appointed gatekeeper of propriety and order. Sophie had encountered women like her before, petty tyrants disguised as concerned citizens, people who mistook control for competence. She had hoped to keep her distance. That turned out to be impossible. Karen had made it a point to introduce herself within an hour of Sophie moving in, appearing at her door with a thin-lipped smile and a clipboard. "We take community standards very seriously here," she had said, stepping inside uninvited and casting a sharp, assessing gaze around the sparsely furnished apartment. "I like to personally welcome all new residents and ensure they understand the expectations." Sophie, balancing awkwardly on her cane, had simply nodded, unwilling to engage. Karen had stayed longer than necessary, asking far too many personal questions. Was she married? Did she live alone? Did she have frequent visitors? Sophie had answered as briefly as possible, increasingly uncomfortable under the scrutiny. "You must let me know if you ever need anything," Karen had said finally, her voice adopting a tone of forced warmth. "I know how difficult it can be when someone is managing challenges like yours." Sophie had clenched her jaw but forced a polite smile. She had learned long ago that there was no point in correcting people like Karen, the ones who saw her condition as a weakness, a problem to be solved rather than a reality to be lived with. After that, things had seemed fine at first. But Sophie had noticed things, small, seemingly insignificant moments that unsettled her in ways she couldn't quite articulate. The way Karen always seemed to be watching her, noting when she left, when she returned. The way conversations with neighbors would abruptly shift when she entered a room, hushed discussions dissolving into forced pleasantries. The way maintenance requests for her unit seemed to take longer to be fulfilled than anyone else's. Then there were the questions. A neighbor in the hallway asking, "Are you okay living alone?" with a strange note of concern in her voice. A passing comment from the concierge about how certain people in the building were worried about whether Sophie could keep up with the demands of independent living. A seemingly casual conversation at the mailbox where Karen once again brought up assisted living facilities as if it were a natural topic of discussion. It had been unsettling, but nothing she could call out directly. It was all just subtle enough to be dismissed as concern, as community-minded nosiness rather than something sinister, until the night her key fob stopped working. It had been late, after a long day of work, when she returned from a trip to the pharmacy and found herself locked out. She had tried the fob again, pressing it firmly against the sensor for the building entrance, but the light remained stubbornly red. Assuming it was a simple glitch, she had stepped back and waited for someone to enter or exit, but after nearly 10 minutes of standing in the cold, no one had appeared. Frustrated, she had called the front desk. "I'm sorry, Miss Langston," the concierge had said after a long pause. "Your access has been temporarily disabled. You'll need to contact the residential board for further assistance." Sophie had frowned. Temporarily disabled? Why? "I don't have that information," the concierge had replied, his voice stiff with discomfort. "You'll have to speak with the board." Sophie had glanced around the empty street, unease creeping in. "Can you at least buzz me in? I live here." A longer pause. I can't do that, Mom. I'm sorry." The line had gone dead. For the first time since moving in, Sophie had felt a genuine sense of fear. Something wasn't right. She had tried calling Karen directly, but the number went straight to voicemail. Text messages remained unread. She had attempted to use the call box at the entrance, but no one had responded. And then, just as she was about to try calling the police, she had looked up. Karen was standing on her balcony, 4 floors above, watching her. She hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. Just stood there, hands resting lightly on the railing, staring down with an expression Sophie couldn't quite read. A slow, creeping dread had settled into Sophie's chest. Something was very, very wrong. And she had a terrible feeling that whatever was happening had been planned. Sophie stood outside the building, gripping her phone tightly as the cold air seeped through her thin sweater. The silence of the street around her felt suffocating. The reality of her situation was settling in fast. She was locked out of her own home, and no one seemed willing to let her back in. The concierge, the security system, even the neighbors she had seen earlier in the lobby had all seemingly vanished. And above her, Karen still stood on her balcony, unmoving, watching. The eerie stillness of her presence sent a wave of unease through Sophie's body. She tried the key fob again, pressing it against the reader, harder this time, as if sheer force would override whatever was preventing her from entering. The sensor beeped, but the door remained locked. Another attempt. Still nothing. The red light was a final, unyielding denial. Sophie's breath quickened, her body tensing with frustration. This wasn't just a malfunction. This wasn't some routine security measure. This was deliberate. A flicker of movement caught her attention from the corner of her eye. A light turned on in one of the lower-level apartments, a silhouette passing briefly behind the curtains before disappearing. Someone was home. Someone who could help. Sophie turned toward the window, raising a hand to knock, but before she could, the light flicked off again, plunging the unit back into darkness. It was as if whoever had been inside had seen her and deliberately withdrawn. She took a slow step back, the weight of realization pressing down on her. This wasn't just Karen. This was bigger. Her fingers hovered over her phone screen. She could call the police. That would be the logical thing to do. But a tight knot of doubt curled in her stomach. What exactly would she tell them? That her key fob wasn't working. That she was locked out of a secure building where she technically wasn't being physically restrained? It wasn't illegal for a private residential complex to deactivate a resident's access. There were clauses in the contract about security measures, board decisions, or emergency lockdowns. If she called 911, what would she even say? That her neighbor was watching her? That her gut told her something was wrong? Sophie took a breath and forced herself to think rationally. Calling the police might escalate the situation in a way she wasn't ready for. If this was a coordinated effort, then Karen had already laid the groundwork to justify what was happening. There had been the whispers, the strange comments from neighbors, the subtle suggestions that Sophie wasn't capable of living alone. If the police arrived and spoke to Karen, what would she say? She's confused. She's been struggling. We've been worried about her mental state. And just like that, the narrative would shift. She wouldn't be a resident locked out of her home. She'd be a woman in distress, someone unwell, someone who needed supervision. Sophie had seen enough stories about guardianship cases, about how easy it was for someone to be stripped of their independence if the right people believed the wrong story. No, she wouldn't give them that opening. Instead, she scrolled through her contacts and found a name she hadn't called in months: Mark Ellis, an old friend and a lawyer who specialized in tenant disputes. It rang twice before he picked up, his voice groggy with sleep. "Soph? Mark, I need your help." There was a rustling noise, the sound of him sitting up. "What's wrong?" "I'm locked out of my building. My key fob isn't working, and the concierge won't let me in." "Okay," he said slowly, waking up fast. "What reason did they give?" "They said my access was temporarily disabled, but no one will tell me why." "And Mark," she hesitated, glancing up again. Karen was gone. The balcony was empty. "I think it was done on purpose." A pause. "Then, are you safe?" "I don't know." She heard the sound of him moving, the rustling of fabric as he pulled on clothes.
"Where are you right now?"
"Standing outside my building." "Do you have anywhere else you can go?" Sophie swallowed. "No." "Okay," he said again, voice tighter now. "Listen, I need you to find a well-lit area and stay where there are security cameras. Do not try to go around the back or force your way in. If they've locked you out, they might be looking for an excuse to escalate. Keep your phone on, keep moving, and stay visible." Sophie exhaled, nodding even though he couldn't see her. "Got it. I'll call the management office and see if I can get answers. If they don't cooperate, I'll head over." Relief flooded through her, but it was quickly undercut by the lingering anxiety coiling in her chest. "Thank you. Just sit tight." The call ended, leaving her standing alone on the cold pavement, illuminated only by the dim glow of the streetlight. The building loomed over her, silent, its windows dark. She resisted the urge to look up again, to check if Karen had returned to her balcony. She didn't want to know. Instead, she followed Mark's instructions, moving toward the security cameras near the front entrance and positioning herself within their view. If something happened to her, at least there would be footage. 15 minutes passed, then 20, then 30. No response from the management office. No call back from Mark. No movement inside the building. And then, just as she was about to call Mark again, the door to the complex clicked open. A man in his 50s stepped out, someone she vaguely recognized from the upper floors. He barely glanced at her, adjusting the strap of the gym bag slung over his shoulder as he moved toward the parking lot. A window of opportunity. Sophie darted forward, slipping inside just as the door was swinging shut behind him. Relief surged through her as she stepped into the warmth of the lobby, but it was short-lived. The concierge desk was empty. That was strange. Someone was always there, even late at night. She hesitated, listening, but the entire floor was eerily quiet. The usual hum of security monitors, the faint murmur of voices from the night staff, all absent. The hair on the back of her neck prickled. Something wasn't right. She turned toward the elevators, debating whether to go straight up to her apartment or check the management office first. Before she could decide, a voice cut through the silence. "MS, Langston." She froze. Karen stood by the stairwell, hands clasped neatly in front of her, watching. Sophie's breath hitched. "What the hell is going on?" Karen tilted her head slightly, as if amused by the question. "You shouldn't have done that." Panic clawed up Sophie's throat. "Done what?" But Karen didn't answer. Instead, she smiled. And then, behind her, the stairwell door opened, and two men stepped out. They weren't security, they weren't residents, and they were blocking the only way out. Sophie's entire body tensed as the two men stepped fully into view, their presence shifting the air in a way that sent a deep, instinctual warning through her nerves. They weren't security, they weren't maintenance, they weren't neighbors. Their faces were blank in that practiced way that suggested they had done this before, that they had walked into buildings like this and had removed people like her with the silent, unquestioned authority that came with knowing no one would stop them. One of them was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a fitted black coat that did little to soften the hard angles of his frame. The other was slightly shorter but no less imposing, his stance relaxed in a way that suggested he had no reason to be concerned about anything she might do. There was nothing aggressive in their body language, no clenched fists, no outright threats, but it was precisely their composure that terrified her the most. They had no doubt they would succeed. Sophie's pulse pounded in her ears as her mind ran through a dozen possible explanations, none of them good. She had seconds to decide how to react. If she panicked, if she ran, would that give them an excuse to grab her? Would it make her look unstable? She forced herself to breathe, locking her knees to keep them from shaking as she turned back to Karen, who hadn't moved, hadn't broken eye contact. The older woman looked almost bored, as if this was a minor inconvenience rather than something that had the potential to escalate into something much, much worse. "Who are they?" Sophie demanded, forcing her voice to stay even. Karen smiled in that calm, knowing way that made Sophie's stomach twist. "That's not important right now." Sophie clenched her jaw. "The hell it isn't." Karen sighed as if she was speaking to a difficult child, shaking her head with the kind of disappointment that wasn't meant to reflect anger but rather inevitability. "Sophie, you've been struggling, haven't you? I know how difficult it must be, trying to manage everything on your own. It's a lot, especially with, well, your condition." A sick, twisting sensation curled in Sophie's stomach. There it was, the same carefully constructed narrative Karen had been weaving for months, the same quiet campaign of doubt and manipulation. It had started with subtlety, just enough for Sophie to second-guess whether she was imagining it, questions asked in the hallway, neighbors offering unsolicited help, comments about how difficult it must be for her to live alone. It had grown, layer by layer, a slow erosion of control that she hadn't recognized until now, when it was far too late to stop it. "You don't look well," Karen continued, her voice taking on a soft, almost maternal quality. "I think you need some help." Sophie's grip tightened around the strap of her bag. "I don't need help," Karen seeked, shaking her head. "I disagree, and I think deep down you know I'm right. People have been worried about you, your neighbors, the board, even the building staff. We've all noticed how much harder things have been for you lately." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. The words were calculated, precise. "We've all noticed." That was the key, wasn't it? This wasn't just Karen anymore. This was an orchestrated effort. She thought back to the odd interactions she'd had with neighbors over the last few months, the sympathetic glances, the sudden distance, the half-hearted offers of help that had never quite felt genuine. She had dismissed them as idle curiosity, as polite concern, but now she saw them for what they were. Seeds, planted deliberately, watered over time. Karen had been laying the groundwork for this moment for far longer than Sophie had realized. Sophie forced herself to straighten, to meet Karen's gaze with unwavering defiance. "This is my home. You don't get to decide if I belong here." Karen exhaled softly, a hint of regret in her expression. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be." She lifted a hand, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but it was enough. The taller man took a step forward. Sophie's heart slammed against her ribs. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to run, but she knew that would be a mistake. If she ran, they would chase, and if they caught her, it wouldn't be framed as an abduction or an attack, it would be a rescue. A distressed woman, unable to care for herself, refusing necessary intervention. They would say she was confused. They would say she was acting erratic. And once that story was in place, it would be nearly impossible to undo. A voice crackled through the intercom, shattering the heavy silence. "Sophie?" Her breath caught. "Mark." The men hesitated, their attention flickering toward the front entrance. Sophie moved. She spun, lunging for the elevator panel and slamming her palm against the button. The doors slid open just as one of the men surged forward, reaching for her. She threw herself inside, jabbing the close button with frantic desperation. The man lunged, fingers brushing the fabric of her sleeve. The doors snapped shut. Sophie staggered back against the wall, her chest heaving as the elevator began its ascent. Her mind raced. Mark was outside. How had he known? Had he been watching the security cameras? Had he called someone? It didn't matter. What mattered was that he was here, that he was witnessing this. That complicated things for Karen, didn't it? The elevator dinged, the doors sliding open to reveal the dimly lit hallway of her floor. Sophie moved quickly, her legs trembling beneath her as she fumbled for her keys. She reached her apartment, shoved the key into the lock, and stumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind her. She locked it, bolted it. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She stood there, gripping the doorknob, waiting, listening. Nothing, no footsteps, no voices. Had they let her go? Her phone vibrated in her pocket, jolting her back to reality. She pulled it out with shaking fingers and answered. "Mark, are you okay?" His voice was sharp, urgent. "I saw you run." "What the hell is going on?" Sophie swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. "They locked me out. Karen had 2 guys waiting for me in the lobby. I don't know who they were, but they weren't security." Mark cursed under his breath. "I called the management office, but no one would give me a straight answer. When I got here, the concierge was gone. Just gone." Sophie closed her eyes. "Mark, I think they're trying to get rid of me." A heavy pause. "What do you mean?" She pressed a hand against her forehead, her mind spinning. "They've been setting this up for months. The questions, the rumors, the way people have been acting around me. I think Karen has been convincing everyone that I can't take care of myself, that I shouldn't be living alone." Mark exhaled sharply. "That's not how this works. She can't just, can't she?" Sophie whispered. Mark didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. People lost their rights all the time, their autonomy stripped away under the guise of protection, of concern. It only took the right combination of influence, manipulation, and bureaucracy. And Karen? She had all 3. Sophie's grip tightened around her phone. "I need to get out of here." Mark's voice was firm. "I'm coming up." "No," she said quickly. "Not yet. If you come up now, they'll know you're here. I need to figure out what I'm dealing with first." Silence. Then, "All right," Mark said, reluctant but trusting. "But I'm not leaving." Sophie exhaled slowly, the weight of the night pressing down on her. Karen had made her move. Now it was Sophie's turn. Sophie sat on the floor of her apartment, her back pressed against the locked door, her breath still coming in shallow bursts. Her hands were shaking, not from fatigue but from the adrenaline that refused to subside. Every instinct in her body screamed that she wasn't safe, that she was only delaying the inevitable, in a way that at any moment Karen or those men could come back and finish what they had started. She had spent her life carefully managing her condition, structuring her world to maintain control, but right now everything was unraveling. Her home was no longer safe. It was a trap. Her phone buzzed in her hand, and she flinched before realizing it was just Mark. She forced herself to answer, pressing the device tightly to her ear as if it could anchor her. "Are they still down there?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Mark hesitated. "I can't see them, but that doesn't mean they're gone. I'm parked across the street. I didn't want to get too close in case they're watching." "They're always watching," Sophie murmured, her fingers curling around the fabric of her sweater. She didn't know how deep this went, how many people were involved, but what she did know was that Karen wasn't acting alone. This had been planned. The months of whispers, the way maintenance requests for her unit had gone ignored while small, deliberate inconveniences had begun piling up, and the neighbors' increasing distance, she hadn't wanted to believe it at the time, had chalked it up to paranoia, but now it was undeniable. Mark exhaled sharply. You need to get out of there. Tonight. Sophie clenched her jaw. And go where? Anywhere but there. A hotel. A friend's place. Hell, come stay with me if you have to. She swallowed. The idea of leaving made sense. Her logical mind knew that staying here was dangerous, but there was a deeper part of her, the part that refused to be pushed out of her own life, that resisted. If she left, she was giving them exactly what they wanted. She had seen the way Karen had looked at her in the lobby, the quiet satisfaction in her expression. She wanted Sophie gone. And if she ran now, if she disappeared in the middle of the night, it would only reinforce whatever story Karen had been telling people about her. That she was unstable, that she wasn't capable of living alone, that she had simply walked away because she couldn't handle the pressure. Sophie squeezed her eyes shut. I need proof. Mark made a noise of frustration. Sophie, this isn't a court case. This is your life. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. You just need to be safe. She shook her head, even though he couldn't see her. If I leave now, they win, and if I come back later to fight this, it'll be my word against theirs. I need something solid. There was a long silence. Then, reluctantly, Mark said, What are you thinking? Sophie's mind was already working, analyzing the pieces she had, the things that didn't add up. Karen mentioned that other people were concerned about me. She made it sound like this was some collective decision, not just hers. Mark was quiet for a beat. You think she documented it? She's too meticulous not to. If she's planning something long-term, she wouldn't just rely on hearsay. She'd need records, something that could justify taking action against me. Mark swore under his breath. You're talking about getting into the management office. Sophie's stomach tightened. If there's anything on file about me, it'll be there. Emails, complaints, maybe even medical records if she's really overstepped. If I can find it, I can stop this before it escalates. There was another pause before Mark spoke, his tone measured but firm. Breaking into that office is a terrible idea. I don't plan on breaking anything, Sophie said, though she wasn't entirely sure how she would gain access yet. I just need to see what's there. Mark exhaled slowly. You're not going to let this go, are you? No, then at least let me help. Sophie hesitated, then nodded. He'd meet me by the service entrance in 20 minutes. She hung up before he could argue. Forcing herself to her feet, Sophie moved quickly through her apartment, grabbing the essentials, her wallet, medication, an old hoodie to make herself less recognizable. She hesitated before opening a drawer and pulling out a flashlight, the small tactical kind her father had given her years ago. It wasn't much, but it was something. The building was eerily quiet as she stepped out into the hallway. The elevator was too risky, so she took the stairs, moving as lightly as she could. Every sound felt magnified, every shadow a potential threat. When she reached the ground floor, she lingered near the stairwell door, waiting, listening. No voices, no movement. She slipped into the corridor leading to the service entrance. It was darker here, the overhead lights flickering dimly, and the air smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and old paint. She pressed herself against the wall as she reached the door to the management office, her pulse hammering in her throat. Mark appeared a moment later, his face tight with concern. This is insane, he muttered, but he didn't try to stop her. Sophie ignored him, testing the handle, locked, of course. But there was a keypad above the knob, the kind that required a passcode. She glanced at Mark. Think Karen's predictable enough to use something obvious? Mark frowned, then reached over and typed in the building's address. The lock beeped. Denied. Sophie bit her lip, thinking. Karen was meticulous, but she was also self-important. She typed in Karen's apartment number. The light flashed green. Mark stared at her. I hate that worked. Sophie pushed open the door, slipping inside with Mark close behind. The office was small, neat, exactly what she had expected. A desk, filing cabinets, a locked safe in the corner. But what caught her attention was the computer, its monitor still glowing faintly. Someone had left it on. She moved quickly, sitting at the desk and clicking through files. It didn't take long to find what she was looking for. A folder labeled Resident Concerns, Langston S. She opened it, her stomach twisting as she scanned the documents. Complaint forms, emails, statements from neighbors. But it was worse than she had imagined. The dates went back nearly 6 months, long before she had started suspecting anything. There were detailed notes about her erratic behavior, mentions of her health affecting her ability to function. Even a fabricated wellness check report stating that she had been seen disoriented in the hallway, struggling to remember where she lived. Sophie's fingers tightened on the mouse. They've been building a case against me. Mark leaned over her shoulder, his expression dark. This isn't just rumors. They were planning to have you declared unfit to live alone. Sophie scrolled further, and then she saw it. A document titled Guardianship Petition, Preliminary Inquiry. Her breath left her body. This wasn't just about getting rid of her. This was about owning her. She had to get out. She had to get out now. But then, behind them, the door clicked shut and locked. Sophie's pulse hammered in her ears as the unmistakable sound of the door locking behind them sent a cold shock through her system. She didn't turn around immediately. She didn't have to. She already knew who it was. The silence that followed was calculated, deliberate, stretching just long enough to let fear creep in before the inevitable sound of slow, measured footsteps filled the room. Mark tensed beside her, his breath shallow, his body angled slightly as if already preparing for a confrontation. But Sophie didn't move. She kept her gaze locked on the glowing screen in front of her, on the damning words that made her skin crawl. Guardianship petition, preliminary inquiry? The reality of it pressed down on her like a weight she couldn't shake, a suffocating certainty that this wasn't just harassment or manipulation. This wasn't about making her leave. This was about removing her ability to choose at all. The footsteps stopped. Karen sighed softly, the same way she had in the lobby when she had tried to convince Sophie she was just struggling. "Sophie," she said, her voice gentle, as if she were addressing a child who didn't understand the consequences of their actions. "You really should have left when you had the chance." Sophie finally turned, her eyes narrowing. Karen stood just inside the doorway, blocking their only exit. Her expression was calm, composed, but there was something else there now, something far colder than the polite condescension she had worn before. She wasn't pretending anymore. There was no need. Sophie had seen too much. Mark shifted beside her, his jaw tight. "You're out of your goddamn mind," he said, his voice low, controlled, but seething with barely contained anger. Karen tilted her head slightly, as if considering the accusation. "I think we can all agree that emotions are running a bit high right now," she said smoothly. "But there's no need for hostility. This doesn't have to be difficult." Sophie's fingers curled into fists. "You're trying to steal my life," she said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "That petition." "That petition," Karen interrupted, her eyes flickering toward the screen, "is simply a precaution. A necessary step to ensure that you receive the care you need." Sophie let out a hollow, humorless laugh. "Care? You mean control? You've been setting this up for months. Lying to my neighbors, faking complaints, creating a paper trail that makes it look like I can't take care of myself." Karen didn't deny it. She didn't even flinch. She just sighed again, that same patient, infuriating sigh, as if she were waiting for Sophie to catch up to the inevitable conclusion. "Sophie, I know this is hard for you to accept, but you've been deteriorating for a long time. You may not see it, but everyone else does. I've tried to be understanding, to give you space, but at a certain point, we have to do what's right, even when it's difficult." Sophie's breath came faster. "What's right? For who? Because it sure as hell isn't for me." Karen's expression didn't change. "That's not for you to decide." A chill ran through Sophie's spine. There was something about the way she said it, the absolute certainty in her tone, that made Sophie realize exactly how far this had already gone. She hadn't just been locked out of her home as a scare tactic. She hadn't just been monitored and manipulated for months because Karen had a personal grudge. This was the final step. She wasn't meant to come back from this. Karen glanced at Mark then, as if just remembering he was there. "And you," she said, her voice losing its softness entirely. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but interfering in this situation isn't going to end well for you." Mark's jaw clenched, but he didn't look away. "You locked her out of her own home. You sent men after her. And now you're telling her she doesn't get a choice in what happens to her?" His voice dropped lower, sharper. "That's kidnapping, Karen." Karen's lips curved into something resembling amusement. "Oh, Mark," she said, shaking her head, "you're a lawyer. You know better than anyone that intent is everything. And our intent has always been about Sophie's well-being." Sophie's stomach churned. The worst part? She was right. On paper, none of this looked like a crime. It was just concern. Just a misunderstood situation. Just a community looking out for one of its own. She had seen enough legal battles to know how this would play out if Karen had her way. She would be labeled uncooperative, unstable, and once that label was attached, once the courts got involved, there was no coming back from it. She had to get out, now. Her eyes flickered around the room, scanning for anything that could be used as an opening, an escape. The filing cabinets were too heavy to move. The windows were too small to fit through. The only real way out was through the door. And Karen wasn't alone. A shadow moved just behind her. One of the men from the lobby. Sophie's pulse spiked. They weren't just here to talk. She caught Mark's gaze, barely shifting her eyes, just enough for him to understand. He tensed, just slightly, just enough for her to know he was ready. Karen must have seen it too. She took a slow step back. "This is pointless," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who wasn't used to being challenged. "It's over, Sophie." Sophie's breath came fast and sharp, but her mind was steady. She wasn't going to be backed into a corner, not by Karen, not by her lies, not by whatever hell she had spent months orchestrating. She shifted her weight. Now, Mark moved first. With a sharp, sudden motion, he grabbed one of the metal office chairs and swung it hard, crashing it against the man just as he stepped forward. The impact sent the man stumbling, knocking him into Karen, who let out a startled cry as she was shoved sideways against the desk. Sophie didn't waste the opportunity. She lunged for the door, yanking it open just as the second man reached for her. His fingers grazed her wrist, but she wrenched free, shoving past him and into the hallway. Mark was right behind her, moving fast, his breathing ragged. "Go, go." They sprinted toward the service exit. Behind them, shouts echoed through the hall, the heavy pound of footsteps following. Sophie's lungs burned, her legs screaming in protest, but she didn't stop. Not when they reached the stairwell, not when they stumbled down the steps two at a time, not even when the cold night air hit her like a wall as they burst through the door into the alley behind the building. Mark grabbed her arm, steadying her. "Car, now." She didn't argue. They ran. The lot was empty except for Mark's sedan, parked just across the street. He fumbled for his keys as Sophie threw a glance over her shoulder. The door to the building was still shut. No one had followed. Not yet. They climbed in, doors slamming shut, the engine roaring to life. Sophie's hands shook as she fastened her seatbelt, her mind still racing. She had almost been taken. If Mark hadn't been there, if she had hesitated for even a second longer, her stomach twisted. It wasn't over. Mark threw the car into reverse, peeling out of the lot just as the service door finally swung open. Karen stood there, watching them leave. And she was smiling. Sophie's hands wouldn't stop shaking, her breath coming in uneven bursts as the car sped through the quiet streets. The world outside blurred into streaks of yellow and white as Mark drove, his grip tight around the steering wheel, his jaw locked in grim determination. Neither of them spoke at first. There was nothing to say, not yet. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on them, a suffocating realization that this wasn't over, that escaping the building had only bought them time. Karen wasn't going to stop. She had planned this too carefully, had orchestrated every piece with a level of precision that suggested this wasn't the first time she had done something like this. That thought sent an involuntary shudder through Sophie's body. Mark finally broke the silence, his voice clipped and urgent. "We need a plan." Sophie swallowed hard, her mind racing through the options, none of them good. "We need proof," she said, forcing the words out. "Karen's already built a case against me. If we just go to the police with nothing but our word, she'll spin it. She'll make me sound paranoid. She'll make you sound like an intruder." Mark let out a sharp breath. "I hate that you're right." Sophie turned to him, her fingers still curled around the seatbelt strap like a lifeline. The petition. The files. That was real evidence. We need to get it. Mark glanced at her before focusing back on the road, his knuckles white. "You're saying we go back?" No, Sophie shook her head. "But Karen's not going to just delete everything. If she's planning to make this official, she'll need to file those papers somewhere. And that means there's a trail." Mark's brows furrowed in concentration. "A lawyer?" Kabutet. Exactly. Sophie's mind was working now, cutting through the haze of fear. She can't do this alone. She's working with someone who knows the legal system, someone who's already prepared to submit that petition. If we can find out who, we can track where those documents are and get ahead of this. Mark nodded slowly. "I know a guy, a clerk at the county courthouse. If anything's been drafted, he might be able to tell us if it's been filed yet." Sophie exhaled. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was something. A starting point. "Let's go." Mark turned the car sharply, heading toward downtown. The courthouse wouldn't be open this late, but if his contact was willing to talk, they didn't need official access, just information. Every minute counted. The city lights flickered overhead as they pulled into a near-empty parking lot. Mark killed the engine and reached for his phone, typing quickly. Sophie watched as his jaw clenched with each passing second, waiting. Then finally, a response. "He's here," Mark muttered, already getting out of the car. Sophie followed, her legs still weak but moving. They entered through a side entrance, walking quickly through the dimly lit halls until they reached a small office tucked away near the back of the building. Mark knocked twice before the door opened, revealing a man in his late 40s, his hair thinning, his expression wary. "Mark, what the hell is this?" he asked, eyeing Sophie with suspicion. "We need a favor," Mark said, stepping inside and pulling the door shut behind them. "And we don't have a lot of time." The clerk crossed his arms. "You're asking me to risk my job?" "We're asking for information," Sophie cut in, her voice steadier now. "Not access, not documents. Just tell us if a guardianship petition has been filed under my name." The man hesitated. Then, with a sigh, he moved to his computer. Sophie's stomach twisted into knots as she watched him type, her entire future balanced on the next few keystrokes. A few moments later, his expression darkened. "There's a preliminary filing," he said. "Not finalized, but drafted. Set for review in 72 hours. Sophie's breath caught. Karen wasn't just planning this, she was days away from making it legal. Mark leaned in. "Who's the representing attorney?" The clerk hesitated again before finally muttering, "David Larson." Sophie didn't recognize the name, but Mark did. His mouth pressed into a thin line. "He's dirty. A fixer for cases that need to be handled quietly. Works with assisted living facilities, estate transfers, that kind of thing." Sophie's stomach turned. "He's the one Karen's using to make this happen." Mark was already moving, pulling out his phone again. "I can get his office address." Sophie's mind raced. This was it. The last piece. Karen had built everything around the illusion of legitimacy, around the idea that once the paperwork was filed, it was official. But if they could intercept it before that happened, if they could find something that proved this was a setup, they could stop it before it was too late. "We need to go now," she said, already heading for the door. Mark followed, his expression grim but determined. "Let's end this." The drive to Larson's office felt agonizingly slow, even though Mark pushed the speed limit. The building was dark when they arrived, but Mark didn't head for the front entrance. Instead, he parked down the street, pulling into an alley where the security cameras wouldn't catch them. "He keeps physical files," Mark said, his voice low. "He doesn't trust digital records." Sophie nodded, swallowing hard. "Then we find them." They slipped around the back of the building. The door was locked, but Mark had expected that. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small leather case, flipping it open to reveal a set of lockpicks. Sophie stared. "You really are a lawyer, right?" Mark smirked. "A lawyer who grew up in the wrong neighborhood." It took him less than a minute. The door clicked open, and they stepped inside. The office was silent, the faint hum of streetlights filtering through the blinds. They moved quickly, Mark heading for the file cabinets while Sophie scanned the desks. She rifled through stacks of paper, her fingers shaking until there. A folder labeled Langston S. Her breath caught as she opened it. It was all there: Karen's complaints, medical records that had been altered, statements from witnesses claiming they had seen her in distress. Lies, every single one of them, carefully designed to strip her of her rights. Mark swore under his breath. "This is enough to burn them." Sophie didn't have time to reply, because outside, tires screeched to a halt. She barely had time to register what was happening before headlights flooded through the window, blindingly bright. Mark grabbed the file. "We need to go, now." They bolted for the back door just as the front entrance burst open. Voices shouted. Footsteps pounded against the floor. Karen had found them. Sophie's lungs burned as they sprinted down the alley, their only advantage seconds ahead of whoever had come after them. Mark reached the car first, throwing open the door, tossing the file into Sophie's lap as he jumped behind the wheel. The moment Sophie slammed the passenger door shut, the first figure appeared at the end of the alley, one of Karen's men. Mark floored the gas. The car lurched forward, tires skidding against the pavement. Sophie clutched the file to her chest as they sped through the city, the reality of what they had just done slamming into her all at once. They had the proof. Karen had lost. But as Sophie glanced in the side mirror, her stomach twisted. Karen wasn't in the car behind them. She was standing in the alley, watching them disappear. And she was still smiling. Sophie sat in the car, staring out the window as the city blurred past her, the lights streaking together in a mess of color that felt almost unreal. Her hands were still gripping the folder so tightly that her knuckles had gone white, but she couldn't force herself to let go. It wasn't over. Not yet. Even with the evidence sitting in her lap, even with the truth finally laid bare, there was something in her gut that wouldn't let her relax. Mark was silent as he drove, his expression hard, his jaw clenched tight enough that the muscles twitched every time he checked the mirror. They had spent the last few hours at the police station, repeating everything, showing them the documents, making sure there was no room for misunderstanding. Detective Alvarez had been quick, had seen exactly what was happening, had wasted no time in pulling together a case that couldn't be ignored. And yet, even as they sat there giving their statements, Sophie had felt it, that lingering, suffocating dread that told her Karen wasn't done. Because Karen had always been 5 steps ahead. Sophie exhaled, pressing her fingers against her temple, trying to will away the pressure building in her skull. She wanted to believe it was over. She wanted to believe that the moment Alvarez had walked out of that interrogation room, his face unreadable, and told them, "We're picking her up tonight," that the nightmare had finally ended. But she had seen the way Karen had watched them leave that alley, the way she had stood there, not chasing, not panicking, waiting. Mark pulled into the parking lot outside her building, cutting the engine but making no move to get out. He turned to her, his expression softer now, the sharp edges of his frustration giving way to something closer to concern. "Are you sure you want to go back there tonight?" Sophie swallowed. The thought of stepping back into that apartment, after everything, made her skin crawl. But it was hers. That was the one thing Karen had been trying to take from her from the beginning, her choice, her independence. If she left now, if she ran, even for one night, it would feel like Karen had won. "I'm sure," she said, though her voice was quieter than she wanted it to be. Mark watched her for a long moment, then nodded. "I'm staying. You don't have to." "I know," he interrupted, reaching for the door handle. "But I'm not leaving you alone with this." She should have argued, but she was too tired, too drained to pretend she didn't want someone else there tonight. Instead, she gave him a small nod and pushed open her door. The lobby was empty when they stepped inside. The concierge desk was dark, abandoned. The silence was suffocating, the absence of sound wrong in a way Sophie couldn't quite explain. She hesitated before pressing the button for the elevator, her body tense, every instinct screaming at her to be ready. But the doors slid open smoothly, and nothing happened, just the quiet hum of machinery as they ascended. The hallway was the same as always, clean, sterile, too perfect. Her apartment door looked untouched. No signs of intrusion, no warnings left behind. But when she unlocked it and stepped inside, she felt it immediately. Something was off. She couldn't place it at first, but as she walked further in, it hit her. The air smelled wrong. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there, a hint of perfume that wasn't hers. Her stomach twisted. She turned slowly, scanning the room, searching for anything out of place. Everything was exactly where she had left it. The couch, the kitchen stools, the neatly stacked mail on the counter. But then her eyes landed on the coffee table, and her breath caught in her throat. A single white envelope sat in the center. Sophie stared at it, her pulse hammering. It hadn't been there before. It wasn't hers. Mark moved first, stepping past her and snatching it off the table, his movements stiff, deliberate. He held it up, his expression dark. "It's sealed." Sophie forced herself to take a step closer. "Open it." Mark didn't hesitate. He ripped the envelope open, pulling out a single sheet of thick, cream-colored paper. His eyes scanned it once, then twice before he exhaled sharply and handed it to her. She took it with shaking hands. "Sophie, you should have taken the easier way out, but you never knew when to quit. I hope you enjoy what comes next." There was no signature, no name. Nothing but those simple, terrifying words written in careful, deliberate handwriting. Sophie's fingers tightened around the paper. Her breath came in sharp, uneven bursts, the edges of her vision blurring as reality crashed over her all at once. Karen was in custody. Karen was done. But this letter meant she wasn't alone in this. Mark's voice was tense. She had help. Sophie swallowed hard, her hands trembling. Of course she did. A scheme this elaborate, this calculated, Karen hadn't done it on her own. There were others. People who had been just as invested in making her disappear. People who were still out there. And they were still watching. Mark grabbed his phone. "I'm calling Alvarez." Sophie barely heard him. She was still staring at the letter, at those neat, careful words, at the confirmation that even though Karen had lost, the game wasn't over. But as she stood there, something inside her shifted. The fear, the exhaustion, the helplessness that had clung to her for months, it was still there, but beneath it, something else was burning. Anger. They had spent months trying to take her life apart, to erase her identity piece by piece, to make her feel small and powerless. But she wasn't small, and she sure as hell wasn't powerless. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. Karen was gone, and whoever was left, they would be next.